This is SoundNotion, the weekly podcast for new music and music news. I'm David McDonald.
I'm Nate Blyton.
I'm Sam Merciers.
And this week we are joined by Daniel Spreadbury. Daniel, of course, was the longtime kind of public face of the Sibelius UK development team. He has, since November 2012, been the product marketing manager for Steinberg's forthcoming scoring application. And Daniel has been on the show before. Daniel, welcome back.
Thanks very much for having me back. Pleasure to be here.
So it's been about 2 years since we've had you on the show, about 2.5 years since you've been working with this new project at Steinberg. How are things going?
Yeah, that's a big question. Is it really nearly 2 years since I was on the show? I think it was like maybe 18 months.
May of 2013, I think.
Oh boy.
I know.
Okay.
We've all gotten 2 years older in that time. Try not to think about it too much.
Time flies when you're dealing with notation minutia.
Well, that is certainly true. Yes, and much more of it's probably going to fly before we're finished. But yeah, so golly, when we were last on here talking together about the project, we'd really only, I guess, really just got started because we really kind of started coding in sort of February, March 2013. Yeah, golly. So yeah, we've been kind of working on the project now for about 2 years, really, a bit more than 2 years, and it's going pretty well. I mean, certainly I'm very pleased with how we're doing in terms of solving the problems we're setting out to solve. I feel like we're doing that well. I think on the other hand, it's been difficult to predict how long anything's actually going to take, despite the fact that obviously the people working on this project have a certain amount of experience working in the field. It turns out that attempting to do things in really a very different way from how we did stuff before, and part of that being because we inherited the code for Sibelius from Ben and Jonathan Finn, who were still, of course, very much there when we were all kind of getting started, but also because we are sort of 2 decades on and able to use newer techniques and newer technologies, and yeah, it's been fantastic, but we still have a way to go.
Well, I would imagine that starting from scratch is such a huge problem for it's also a benefit, I would imagine, too, but it's just such a huge project because you are now competing with some other applications that have spent that whole time getting more mature themselves and getting more powerful and more feature-rich every time they iterate, and you're still working on the first iteration. Is that ever frustrating to look at what these other applications are doing?
I mean, I think on one level, certainly, yes. I mean, I think it's also true to say that perhaps in terms of the more mature applications on the market, their evolution is maybe not as fast as maybe it was a few years ago. Although, of course, there is some incredible innovation going on, in particular on the web and so on. Things like Noteflight have got millions of users, and then of course MuScore has been downloaded millions of times, and there are then also great tools like SoundSlice and NeoScores and other things. So there's plenty of activity perhaps in the world of scoring software, much more than maybe there has been for a few years. But I think the incumbents are kind of in a bit of a period of rebuilding perhaps. So on one level, yes, of course, it's frustrating to see everything else out there is moving ahead, and we are moving ahead too. But we are, as you say, moving ahead from behind and doing it somewhat in secret. Yes, somewhat in secret. Although I blab my mouth a bit too much about this stuff, so I'm going to try and censor.
Did you ever get scolded for that?
There've been a couple of occasions when perhaps I've said things that I maybe shouldn't have said, but
Well, we'll forgive you.
This notation platform is the Avengers Age of Ultron spoiler thing of the music nerd world, where people just can't wait to see what happens.
Yes. Although hopefully there'll be less vibranium involved.
Well, so I think one of the things that drove that really fast period of growth in scoring applications was when Sibelius started to get powerful enough that it was really competing with Finale, and then both of them had to start to really push their development cycles and really innovate a lot a lot more, seriously than they had before, at least than Finale had before. And I would hope that when a new application comes from Steinberg, that it will have a similar effect on those two players. And I wonder about these. You mentioned a bunch of these new kind of. I don't want to denigrate them by saying that they're lighter, but they're not as powerful as Finale and Sibelius, and they're designed in a lot of ways for different kinds of users than Finale and Sibelius are designed for. But do you ever feel like you are learning things from those smaller applications that are really not designed to be the kind of thing that Steinberg is building, but are innovating nonetheless?
Well, I think certainly there is some very, very interesting things happening. And like you say, that the use cases of those other applications are really not the use cases for the big sort of monolithic desktop scoring apps in many ways. I suppose you could say that MuseScore is perhaps seeking to occupy the same space as Finale and Sibelius. But then if you speak to the guys behind MuseScore, their actual mission is to make all music sort of freely available. It's more of a free culture movement than it is necessarily anything else, and it has the nice side effect of having some very good scoring software sort of coming out as a consequence of that desire to see the musical culture kind of more freely available. Obviously, Noteflight has done an amazing job of building a very organic community of especially very young musicians. The people who are using Noteflight are typically not users of any other scoring program, and in fact that may be their first exposure to sheet music, and the fact that it's so easy to use and so easy to share and so easy to adapt other people's music means that there is a really tremendous sort of sense of, it is almost a social network in its own right, I would say, the Noteflight community, and that's pretty cool to have built a social network around music writing and composing. So those things are really, really incredible, and they do sort of tackle a different side to what we're trying to do, which is really, we're kind of old-fashioned in a way. We see ourselves as tool makers. We want to make a tool that is sufficiently powerful, flexible, efficient, that professional musicians in whatever field they might be in, whether they're composers or engravers or copyists or orchestrators working on a big film or video game project or whatever, we really want to provide them with a tool that is going to help them to do their job more efficiently, get to a better result more quickly, and I think that does sort of set us in a different kind of path than some of those other tools in terms of where we put our focus, and in particular I think that on things like, firstly, making sure the workflow is really good, which is not to say these other programs are not focused on workflow, but I think that because we have the advantage of running in a sort of a rich environment of a desktop operating system rather than, say, inside a browser, that gives us certain advantages in terms of what we can do workflow-wise. Obviously, also running on the desktop gives us the ability to use more of the computer's power more efficiently as well. No matter how good these JavaScript compilers and things get, I think it's still fair to say that you can do a lot more if you've got access to the full horsepower of your computer, and that allows us to do not only things, hopefully in the end, to do with playback and audio and all of the other cool stuff that we're getting from the Steinberg technology in Cubase and so on that we're building in, but also in terms of the quality of the graphical result, which is certainly, for me personally, that's something very near and dear to my heart. I really want to make sure that our program produces as good a result as we can possibly make it as automatically as possible, so that less time is spent tweaking stuff. Ideally, it would be fantastic if you could simply type the music in and then basically just print it straight out without really having to worry about whether or not there are any legibility problems in the music, and that's really the goal that we're setting ourselves.
Yeah, and that's actually something that's really interesting to have been reading. I think the last time you were on this show, we were talking a lot about music fonts, and the new Bravura music font that you had created and used as kind of the showcase for the new font standard, the SMuFL font standard. And that was actually, I was just scrolling back through. I'm looking at the Making Notes blog, which if anybody is listening and has not checked out Making Notes, that's blog.steinberg.net. You should definitely check it out. It's where Daniel posts about quarterly or so updates to what the team is working on. And in fact, Daniel, if you want to step back into the time machine, this was the last time you were on the show was right after the very first development diary.
Crumbs.
The very first development diary. So, you know, we were talking about that, and looking through the development diary, it's all very intently focused on notation things. There's very little about computer things, which I think is really interesting for, you know, a team developing a software application, that all of these updates have not really been about the software as much as they've been about the product, the end result engraving thing. You know, it's been really interesting to dig into a lot of these issues about engraving that have come up, because I think it's something that at least I, as a composer, usually take for granted. But at the same time, when I look at a score, especially a student score, because a lot of times a student is not digging into a lot of the fiddly settings of their scoring application, it's very clear. You made this in MuseScore, you made this in Finale, you made this in Sibelius, it looks like that your project is going to have a similar feature, that when I look at this thing from Steinberg, I'll look at it and say, oh, that you made that in Steinberg's thing.
Yeah, I think hopefully you'll be saying that less because there are obvious errors, and more because it's more obviously right more of the time. Hopefully.
Well, no, I don't think so. Most of those errors, I think, I would at least forgive from one of these. But yeah, I think that's true. But the font and the layout stuff is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I've been amazed actually at how much SMuFL has taken off. I mean, I guess when I was last on, if it was really that long ago, then I think certainly SMuFL hadn't hit 1.0 yet. It was very much under active development. I probably only was a few months away from having just kind of announced it for the first time at the Music and Coding conference in Mainz in Germany. And since then, it's really been amazing to me how many people, whether they are font designers, because we have a few people who are actually working on their own fonts now. There's one commercially available already, which is a revision of Robert Pierchot's November font, which came out in February. And that's kind of, if you're a Finale user, you probably know about that font, because it's sort of the first one that really looked, I would say, kind of more like with some of the imperfections of plate engraved music, rather than trying to be a very clean digital reproduction of that. And so quite a lot of Finale users kind of got quite into that font, and Robert did a big revision and made it all SMuFL compliant. And there are a few other font designers who are working on other fonts, which hopefully will be announced fairly soon. And apart from just the fonts, Bravura is turning up everywhere now, which is really interesting.
Really
many
beautiful.
people. Well, thank you. I'm really pleased that people do really like the look of it. And obviously, I think the fact that we decided to release it under the open font license has really enabled a lot of folks to use it. So SoundSlice uses it. StaffPad, that amazing new app for Surface, uses Bravura. There are many apps that are using it for their notation display. There's some good iOS apps that are using it. There's a good one called, I think it's called Groove Academy, which is a pretty cool percussion tuition app that's using it. So really, there's been a huge amount of Bravura being picked up and used by various applications, which is really gratifying for me, because a heck of a lot of work went into it, and to see it become something of a sort of a standard in the last year or so has really been really, really gratifying. I'm not quite sure what it gets us, what it gets Steinberg really, except to say that people.
Well, it gets that font standard available right now. People are creating new fonts. I feel like if that font standard, it didn't have a font to start it with, then people wouldn't be embracing it as they are. But yeah, I think it's great.
Yeah, and I think that we're continuing to see new people kind of getting on board. And I was in Frankfurt for the Music Messe a couple of weeks ago, attending the Music XML community meeting, where one of the topics for discussion was integration of SMuFL with Music XML, which is quite an interesting project in its own right, so that Music XML can more richly refer to some of the perhaps more obscure symbols that maybe aren't currently encoded semantically in MusicXML. And a number of people came up to me afterwards and sort of said they were using Bravura or using SMuFL, and it's just very cool to know that this rather nerdy thing, which has occupied a great deal of my time and the time of a couple of my colleagues, has actually taken off and stands a chance of being adopted by various different programs, and as you say, one of the things I really hoped for was that it would stimulate the development of new fonts, or at the very least make it possible for somebody who had the crazy idea of spending all this time building a music font to actually give them a standard to kind of target that would then would allow their work to be used by a variety of applications, because that's been one of the big problems, is that you go to all this trouble and then it only works with Finale and maybe even only certain versions of Finale, or it only works with certain versions of Sibelius, and Lilypond uses a totally different mapping again, and so on. So hopefully by this standard becoming a little bit more widely adopted, it will stand as a kind of a sort of a rallying point for people who are interested in either implementing music notation in their application of whatever kind, as a means of, okay, we've got MusicXML we can use for interchange, we've got SMuFL that we can use for display to an extent, and then also it will hopefully stimulate the development of new fonts, which will give users of hopefully lots of different programs many new fonts to choose between. And as you say, you can sort of tell which program a piece of music was written in very often by looking at the font. And so one of the things that we all want as working on stuff and thinking about the visual side of things is having more choice in that regard, in the same way that it would all be terribly boring if everybody, well, of course a lot of people do just use Times New Roman, but at least to have the option of using things other than Times New Roman or the equivalent of Times New Roman. Although now that Bravura is so popular, maybe Bravura is the Times New Roman of music notation, I'm not sure.
Well, the thing though about Bravura compared to Times New Roman is that Bravura is a new thing, and maybe it will become that kind of standard boring thing. But the thing is that like Times New Roman is kind of not very interesting, but Bravura is pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. Like there's some things about it that I think are really like that make it stand out from everything else. And Times New Roman is designed to like look like everything else.
Sure. Yes, that's true.
I'm glad that you mentioned MusicXML and semantically, describing music, because I think all of this effort that you're putting into the algorithms and the engine to lay everything out and engrave everything is going to be of great benefit to new users who are going to have to be importing a bunch of stuff where the computer only knows it as a semantic blob and doesn't really understand. When you export something as MusicXML, it doesn't have as much display information in it. And if the SMuFL and Steinberg engines can figure all that stuff out, then that would be a lot less tweaking in the import step for new users.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, MusicXML does have a surprisingly rich vocabulary of things to describe graphical positioning and so on. But one of the big problems with it is that it's not really clear, and this is not necessarily the fault of the specification, although it is a bit kind of lacking in that area, to be completely honest, but mostly because there are so many implementations of MusicXML, and they've all been done from different versions of different specifications and so on, that there isn't necessarily a huge amount of agreement among the implementations about what exactly, when you specify the X or Y offset for something, what is it relative to? which is one of the things that hopefully will be addressed in forthcoming revisions to MusicXML. The way that we approach that when we're importing MusicXML into our application is we simply throw away all of the positioning information. We ignore it altogether. And the reason that we do that, and of course there are certain use cases where that won't be the right thing to do. So ultimately we'll probably have options for whether or not we totally throw away all the layouts and positioning information, or whether we bring as much of it in as we are able to. But the reason that we throw it all away is that I suppose firstly because MusicXML has been a very major part of the way that we've been testing what our application does, and a way of bringing the data into our application so that we can before we could input music directly and so on, and we still can't input all of the different things that our program can notate directly using the actual built-in input methods. So we often end up authoring test data in another application and then bringing it in via Music XML. And so actually throwing away all of that presentation information is very important towards seeing what the results of our algorithms are doing. But it does actually have a really strong benefit, I think, for down the line. And I think in a way also that the constraints of the fact that in our development right now, if something isn't quite right in terms of whether an accidental is too close to a note or the note spacing is not quite right, it isn't actually possible to tweak it in our application right now. You can't actually get in there and move things around. That will come, obviously, but right now that's not implemented. So it's actually a very good lever to keep us honest in terms of making sure that we're trying to get the best results possible automatically, because right now if we want to see good results we have to get them automatically because we can't tweak them by hand. And down the line I think what that will really give us is that this focus on ensuring that that we're further down what I like to call the continuum of rightness, because music engraving is not right and wrong. It's just more and more right. It's more and more rich rules or more complicated rules to cover more and more unlikely situations, effectively. And so we're just trying to go further down that road. We're never going to go all the way down that road where there will be a situation where that you can throw at our program where it will do something incredibly sophisticated. You'll go, wow, I can't believe it could do that. No, it'll be more likely that eventually you'll get to sort of three-stave Ravel piano music with slurs that go, between stave number 3 and stave number 1, and then back down to stave number 3 again. And they'll go, well, that's not quite right, but at least I can fix it. We're not going to get that automatically right, but we're going to get a heck of a lot closer than any of the other programs do. And part of that is because, as I say, we haven't had the ability to actually get in there and fix these things by hand. So it means that we're more likely to continue working on the algorithms to make them produce better results. And I think that will pay dividends in the long run, because it does mean that you can imagine at some future point where we're using our engine to render just arbitrary music XML, maybe on a tablet, on a Surface or on an iPad or whatever, and you'll get, regardless of whether you have the device in landscape or portrait, or whether you want the music yay big or yay bigger, you'll still get very, very good results. Even though we won't be able to use any of the positioning information from the original file, it will still look very good because we're putting so much focus on making these algorithms do the right thing. And hopefully, we're talking now long term, when people are buying less paper music because their devices are actually a better environment for consuming sheet music than paper, which I think is still not really true just yet, but will become more true in the next few years. Then hopefully it'll be technology like ours that is what's going to enable that kind of paper plus, as it were, experience of using music, because it'll still look as if an engraver has sweated over all the details, which in a way they have. It would be us guys working on it for years and years and trying to make sure these algorithms work well, which is not quite the same, you know what I mean? But the end result will hopefully be that you can take any old music, throw it on a device where our engine runs, and you'll get something that is better than legible by default without needing to do anything.
Well, and so that's it. That brings up my next question, is that if the engine is taking care of all of that stuff on my behalf as the person writing music into it, how much agency do then I have to disagree with it?
Yeah, well, right now, not a whole lot, to be completely honest.
Well, so I guess the question is really how do you balance kind of the simplicity of just plot my stuff in there and spit out something beautiful, and the power of I know this is how it is traditionally done, but I would like to actually defy the tradition in this particular bit of notation.
Absolutely. Well, we're trying to kind of do it on two levels really, which is that quite a lot of the decisions that the program makes, they're kind of high-level decisions for you, like in a given meter, time signature, how do I want the rhythms to be notated by default? Do I want to see in 4/4, do I want to see the half bar always separated? So do I ever want to allow, for example, a half note starting on the second beat of the bar to be notated as a half note, or do I need it to be notated as a quarter note tied to a quarter note, or a crotchet in old money? Do I need to see that notated that way or not? And of course you might type in that bar of music and go, hey, I actually wanted to see a half note there, And what we don't want you to do is then start mucking around with that individual half note, because, as I say, at a high level, we're trying to have a fairly sophisticated set of rules for how the music is notated, not just how it's engraved, which I think is one thing. That's like the distance between X and Y must be this, and the exact way that I want my staff lines to be drawn is like this, and my bar lines should be like this, and so on. That's the engraving. I'm talking really about how the music is actually notated. And that's much more like, say, how you would interact with the scoring page in a sequencer or a DAW. Like how is the display quantization working? So we have this whole other level where you can set all of the what we call notation options. We have engraving options and we have notation options. And the notation options allow you to do things like specify how rest should be set up in compound meters, and how should you deal with things that cross the half bar in time signatures that have a half bar, like 12/8 and 4/4 and so on. And the idea is that, okay, so you type some music in, it doesn't maybe it's not notated exactly the way you want. Rather than then getting in there and trying to change individual details, you instead go and find the rule that applies to that particular aspect of notation, change it, and then it changes everywhere. So scoring programs have always had that kind of level of control for engraving. You can always go and choose in one place how big your note heads are, or how thick your stave lines are, or whatever. What they haven't necessarily had so much of is one place where you can choose all of the actual rules of how the music itself should be notated. And what we're trying to do is provide, an extra level of control, a high level of control over that stuff. Of course, if you then find that, okay, well, in this one particular case, I just want this half note to be notated as a half note, but I'm happy for it to be a quarter note tied to a quarter note the rest of the time, yes, obviously there'll be a way of overriding that one case as well. But we're trying to put in control really at the high level, so that I often say, I think I said this in the blog, that automation is good if it does the thing that you would have done anyway. And we're not so sort of crazy to think that what we want is what everybody wants. And so instead we're trying to put in rules that will allow you, as the user of the program, to influence the automation. There will obviously still be cases where you have to get in there and change something by hand, no doubt, and so we're trying to give you the power to do that as well. But that is kind of almost like the step of last resort. We want you to look at the engraving options and the notation options before you go in there and start changing individual items. But of course you'll have the power to do that if you need to.
Well, when you figure out all those notation options, can we codify them and make sure that all my students know them? Because my composition, I have university composition students that still struggle with rests and compound meters.
Yes.
Things like that.
Well, I was going to ask, can we have a setting like the composition teacher setting where it locks out their ability to write consecutive dotted rhythms in simple meter? and then it flashes, you should not be doing this. Actually, on that...
Like in Microsoft Word, just like a little reg.
Yeah, a little clippy. That's what it needs.
Yeah.
It needs a little Sam saying.
Are you sure that's what you mean? Are you sure that's what you mean?
Well, I mean, by default, in fact, it probably won't let you, depending on, if I imagine you're writing like dotted eighth note followed by another dotted eighth note in simple time, it won't be notated as two dotted notes. The first one might be notated as a dotted note if it's on the beginning of a beat, but the second one certainly won't, because it won't be on the beginning of a beat. So it will notate that one as a 16th tied to an 8th for sure, because that's just the right thing to do. I actually do think that's going to be interesting.
Well, I'm going to quote you on that.
Describing it in like moral terms. It's just right and wrong.
Well, like I say, music engraving is not necessarily about that. You can't necessarily say that it's right and wrong, but I think there are certain things that are much more right than others. And the way that we approach this stuff is that we want the music to, I talk a lot on the blog about how in music engraving is a skill, a craft that was developed over hundreds of years and passed down by one generation of master craftsmen to the next, until basically it all kind of died out in the sort of 50s and 60s, just because economics didn't work and technology was starting to get involved and so on and so forth. And we don't want to see that lost. And computer engraving, if you know what you're doing, allows you to get back towards that, and we're trying to get much further towards that than other computer engraving does. But I think there is also, music theory and all of that other stuff is another whole area where computers haven't necessarily helped, because, and I'm in two minds about this, but I'll go down the road I was going down. Computers can assume that they can assume too much about the user. And I think particularly when you're talking about a composition student, if you assume that a composition student knows that you shouldn't have two dotted eighth notes one after the other in a simple time, then obviously the program can allow them to do that, but it won't stop them from doing it if they don't know that they shouldn't.
Right.
And I'm not saying on the one hand that we want our application to take the place of somebody teaching you why that's right and why that's wrong, but I think it's true to say that so much more music is written these days, so much more music is notated these days than has ever been notated at any time in history, because computers make it possible, that on the one hand you can say, well, we don't want computers to replace teaching, and no, I certainly don't want computers to replace teaching, although there is that saying, if a computer can replace a teacher, then it probably should. Teachers need to bring more to the table than just the rules of music theory, right? But so on the one hand, but on the other hand, so much music is written by people who are not going to learn the rules of music theory, but who could perhaps experience a certain amount of embarrassment when they put it in front of a live musician and get something other than what they expected, because they haven't known how it should be presented to that real human being. And we can hopefully help. And again, I think that it's hopefully not condescending to the professional to say, do you know what, the program, you can just type dotted eighth followed by dotted eighth. The program doesn't think you're an idiot, and for not notating it that way. It's trying to make it quick. It's trying to make it efficient for you. It's obviously going to be more efficient for you as a professional to enter that note that is a dotted eighth in length by just typing dot eighth. That's going to be quicker. It doesn't, it's not saying to you, oh well, you should really have known that should be a 16th tied to an eighth. No, it just we want to make it as quick as possible to get the music in and to have it notated correctly. So as I say, you can kind of look at it in two ways, but I think that this definitely falls under the category of automation that the program can do for you, because it is the right thing to do and it's what you would have done anyway if you knew to do it, which I think is often the problem with all of these issues, either of notation or engraving, is that you don't necessarily know that that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, it sort of suggests to me that it might be beneficial to have maybe more than two, but I'm thinking like two modes, like the sort of composition student freeform mode where it sort of takes you at your word a little bit more, and then the arranger, sort of more common practice arranger kind of mode where it makes it a little more, straight down the middle, a little more, quote, by the rules as a default.
Turn on autocorrect.
Yeah, sort of like that.
Well, I mean, funnily enough, we were actually talking just about that very issue just a couple of days ago in the office, and in fact, one of our testers was looking at the note input and was kind of taken a tiny bit aback by the fact that, and he's used the program a lot and he knows what we're doing. So, but he was taken a little bit aback by the fact that the program didn't notate the music exactly using the durations that he'd specified, i.e., you have a palette on the screen where you can choose quarter note and then you can put a dot and then you type it in, but it doesn't always come out that way because it's not appropriate for it to be dotted at that rhythmic position in the bar or whatever. So, and I think it will take a bit of getting used to, because if you're used to pretty much any other scoring program that I'm aware of, I mean, I think obviously if you're using a sequencer, then the sequencer's quantized rules will determine all that stuff for you, and hopefully they follow good music theory practice as they do so. But certainly if you're using a scoring program, where I think there is this assumption that if you tell the program to notate this duration, then it will do that, then I think this will come as something of a new experience if you're used to those other programs, because by default, and I think this is the right thing to do by default, it won't necessarily notate using the exact written duration. Obviously the note will be the length that you specified, but it won't necessarily be written as a single, dotted this or dotted that. However, we were talking about, well, what about if you really do want to make sure that it does do exactly what you tell it? Well, we will almost certainly have a mode somewhere, probably hidden away in a dialog box, because I think it's maybe not a great default to have, because you want, again, we spent all this time coming up with all of these sophisticated algorithms for ensuring that music is notated at least, correctly in inverted commas, but nicely in any given meter at any rhythmic position in that meter, with any complex arrangement of tuplets or whatever else you might have going on. And it would be a shame to then switch that off by default so that nobody actually has the benefit of it. Because again, if you are, let's say, an arranger, or even if you are an engraver and you're doing the note input, the data entry, being able to specify these things using the simplest possible terms is going to save a lot of time. And then hopefully, as I say, you look at it after you've done the input, it doesn't look quite right, you change the notation options that change the rules, so that then everything then gets recast in the new way. Oh, well, I do or I don't want, I do want dotted rests in compound time, or I don't want dotted rests in compound time. One button will change that for the whole project, and then you can go through and make case-by-case changes as you need them.
Awesome. This is a really personal question for me, but I'm sure lots of composers have encountered this. Have you started dealing with the idea of doing unbarred, unmetered music, which is a contemporary composer kind of thing? And I've done a long, complex piece in Finale this way, and it is not easy. And you really have to hotwire the program to make it give you what you're looking for.
Yeah, no, what we definitely do have support for open time signatures. In fact, you can just basically type X. You get a big X open time signature, and then you can just type in as much music as you like, and it will just keep going. You can even, right now by default, it sort of assumes that it's just going to do everything in kind of beat groups of quarter notes, but you will be able to also set up, if you actually have some kind of regular repeating rhythmic pattern inside that longer open sort of time signature, that sort of bar line-less tractive music, you'll be able to set that up as well. And it's as easy as writing music in bars, basically, in our program. And you'll be able to sort of, if you need to obviously have a system break or whatever, anywhere in the middle of that bar lineless sort of open time signature passage, no bother. Wherever you need it, it'll do it. It's going to be very, very easy, much easier than I think more or less any other program to date makes that.
Well, that's enough to sell me just about right there. Because, like you said, system break. System break is the hardest because you're basically making weird time signatures to accommodate all your stuff. So then changing system breaks becomes a nightmare because then you have to re-notate, like change this bar to a different bar and move the extra notes to another bar and hide that time signature, and it's, well,
I feel the pain. Yes,
you know what I'm talking about.
I do, absolutely. You won't have to do any of that in our program. You have my word.
I'm also wondering about I'm not sure about Finale, but I know Sibelius has implemented a little bit of like the ability to use the program to make educational worksheet kinds of things. And I hadn't realized how important that might be to me until the past 2 years when I've been teaching college. And the ability to easily crank out, just something like a stack, like make a thing, fill in the 4-part harmony in this chorale and have it so that you could do that really fast. And now I do it for my wife, and I take it and export a graphic and then put it in Photoshop and blah, blah, and it's just a long, convoluted process. You guys doing anything for support of that type of thing?
We definitely will over time. I'm not sure that's going to be in our very first version. I mean, our view on education is that, Sibelius and Finale are very well entrenched in education. I would love to see our program, don't get me wrong, I would love to see our program used in education as widely as those other programs are today. That would be fantastic and hopefully actually perhaps beneficial to students and teachers because of the way that the program tries to do the right thing, and it reinforces the learning that you're doing in terms of music theory, as well as allowing you a nice environment to compose in and all the rest of it, and to produce beautiful music to print out and play with your fellow students and what have you. So I'd absolutely love to see the program used in that environment, but we have to be realistic about the fact that institutions are not going to be able to just turn around and turn their back on sometimes very large investments they've made in Finale, Sibelius, and other solutions over the years. So what we're doing is we would certainly love to see college professors and people who are teaching at tertiary level and music majors who are studying at college level using our program, because I think they will really benefit from its power and its flexibility and hopefully its beauty as well in terms of its capabilities as a compositional and arranging environment, but we absolutely want to be able to see it being used even in secondary education, in general music. That would be fantastic. I think we will have to do a kind of a more cut down version that we can perhaps sell for a cheaper price in order to make that a possibility for education, and that will come a bit further down the line. But in terms of allowing professors to make teaching materials, yes, we want to be able to do that. But some of those kind of very nitty-gritty details of making sure that you can get things out in just this size or that size, or you want to combine music and text in very specific ways that are quite different from how you normally need to use text when you're just writing a regular score, even if it's like a critical edition with footnotes. The sort of balance of text and music on the page when you're doing teaching materials is very different. So absolutely we'll get there, but I can't say for sure that it'll be perfect in version 1. I mean, I can't say anything be perfect in version 1.
Nothing's perfect. It just gets better and better.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Isn't there an old computer science trope that if your first version is perfect, then you waited too long to release it or something like that?
Yes.
Isn't that an old thing?
Yes, that's absolutely right.
Sort of dovetailing on the educational question, I'm wondering about workflow between the engraving platform and the other Steinberg products, because we all know that I'm not a huge fan of contests, but entering contests is a thing composition students do, and most contests will accept some sort of MIDI rendering, playback, and the opportunity there with all the great Steinberg products, it seems fantastic. So I'm wondering if, in the same way you want the notation and the engraving to make good decisions as much as possible, have you guys addressed the idea of how to make good playback in that way, and integrating with other more sophisticated audio products that Steinberg makes? Because I have students who need to enter something in a contest, and it would be nice if we could get something that's more acceptable than what they're already getting. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, I completely understand where you're coming from. I mean, yes, again, this ends up being kind of a long-term thing, because right now we're fortunate in that our little team in London can work pretty much independently from the guys in Hamburg, who have their own roadmaps for, we have teams working not only on the next version of Cubase and Nuendo, but the next version after that as well. There's a very full roadmap, and the guys there are cranking out amazing stuff all the time. So to kind of actually bring our two projects together, where they're really doing kind of interchange at a sort of deep and meaningful level, is going to require a good deal of planning, and also for us to have something that is a lot more like a complete and functioning product before we can really get into that nitty-gritty stuff. So the general approach that we're taking is that we're going to have Cubase's audio engine sort of transplanted from Cubase into the heart of our program. So our program will basically have exactly the same audio capability as Cubase does, which itself is pretty cool right off the bat. So we'll have the same VST hosting. We will have hopefully VST expression maps and VST note expression. We will have some of the effects that are coming in from Cubase as well, some of the built-in ones, for example, Inhalion, and we'll also have the potential to have the same kind of signal path and mixing and routing that Cubase has. Now, some of that is maybe not going to be unlocked in our very first version, because what we don't get is any of the user interface that comes along with that stuff, and we also don't think that maybe the full Cubase mix console is necessarily the best user interface for a scoring program, although aspects of it certainly are, in terms of the way the channel strips are integrated and all the rest of it, and the way the faders are managed is very nice, and there are certainly some so we'll definitely be obviously using the work of our colleagues in Hamburg as for strong inspiration when we come to do that. And of course it's important that our products have a kind of a family resemblance between them. But in terms of whether we're going to have the same level of control, the same level of ultimate tweakability that you have in Cubase in our program, no. We want to make sure that the mission for each project is clearly maintained, and I think it is not necessarily in our mission to have a complete digital audio workstation, just as perhaps in Cubase it isn't necessarily the mission to have a complete, publication quality engraving platform built in. So if we're going to have sort of separate worlds but with a big common area, which is the fact that we can run the same audio engine, then that's going to be our starting point, and then we will figure out how to kind of bring the two close together. And I've seen commenters on my blog saying, "Oh, I can't believe they're not integrating this thing with Cubase in the very first version." Well, I think that there are sound reasons for not doing that. Firstly is that we actually have, and this is a commercial reason, which is a perfectly acceptable reason, despite what people might think, we can actually sell more copies of the software if we sell a brand new separate package rather than if we incrementally improve the scoring capabilities of Cubase. So there's a simple commercial reality there. Steinberg's making a big investment in us as a team to build this thing for them, something we're incredibly grateful for this opportunity to do. And we believe that we can actually address a separate kind of customer who isn't perhaps well served by Cubase and Nuendo in their scoring work right now, or not as well served as they could be. But we want to do that separately to focus ourselves on producing that high-end engraving program to begin with. And then over time, we can actually start to bring hopefully some of our technology directly into Cubase and more of Cubase's technology directly into our application, and they will come closer together, although they will never each become, the other one through kind of chimera of digital audio workstation and scoring program. They will maintain their separate identities, but we think that it's important for us to establish what we're doing first. And like I say, the guys in Hamburg, they're doing amazing work, but they are very, very busy with the roadmaps that are set out for their existing customers. And scoring is definitely an important part of what Cubase users want to use, but it is not to the exclusion of everything else that they're doing. And there are some amazing features coming out, like in the new version of Nuendo, which is the audio post tool that we make, it's the first program that has really, really tailored features for games audio workflows and actually integrates with the Wise games system, for games audio that pretty much every major game studio is working with. And that's the kind of thing, that is really, really important that the guys in Hamburg are able to just kind of power away on the things that make sense in their roadmap. And obviously there will come a point when it makes sense for us to be working on more integrated solutions, but we need to get ourselves more established before we do that.
You mentioned the comments on the blog. Oh, sorry, Nate, go ahead.
No, I was going to talk about the blog too, and kind of take a step back to the notation that we talked about earlier in the episode. I was like, the most recent post that you've done, kind of about beaming and grace notes, and talking about just the research and the history and getting everything together. It does really feel like a generous thing you're doing for the world of music students.
Well, thank you. Yeah,
I had to actually. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say somebody. It was actually one of the developers of MuseScore came up to me when I was in Frankfurt, a guy Nicolas, who's one of their main developers, and he said, "Oh, thank you for doing these blog posts. I've twice now managed to put up, completely by coincidence, put up a blog post with sort of a really detailed examination of a particular area of engraving at just the moment they happen to be working on it, and I've happened to actually kind of give them some ideas and some help and so on, which is kind of an unintended, not necessarily positive consequence of doing it, in as much as we're doing this, on the one hand, yes, I do really enjoy communicating the minutiae of this stuff to people, not because I feel like I'm up in some ivory tower and I understand this and nobody else does, but I actually really think there's a lot of joy to be gained in looking at these things. Why do they work the way they do? I think that we can all take a lot of these details for granted. I mean, heck, when I was a student, I certainly did. I did all of my notation by hand when I was a student because I'm that old now. There weren't really good scoring programs on the computer back in those days, and so I did all of it by hand. And I don't have a particularly neat manuscript, it must be said. But it was just something we didn't even really talk about. There is so much always to talk about. I had like an hour at a time with my tutor who was doing, he taught me both the history and the compositional theory stuff and so on. And we would always be talking about the music, which is kind of what you should be talking about, I suppose. And because the stuff that I was doing at that time was sort of pretty much purely academic, it never actually got performed, which is definitely a blessing, I would say, on the whole. We didn't spend any time sort of thinking about the performability of it and about why the notation works the way that it does. It just wasn't really something that really entered into to what we were doing. And I think there are a lot of people who are really, really invested in music, people who are composers, people who are performers and so on, and they have a kind of intrinsic understanding of why these things matter, but they're not really necessarily able to articulate it particularly well. And certainly, I'm not saying I knew about the history of beams all that detailed before I went and researched it. I didn't, but I found it really, really interesting to look at how they evolved and so on. And I thought that there would be people out there who would also find that interesting. And so part of what we're doing with those blog posts really is firstly, we want people not to forget about us while we're beavering away on the first version of our program. We really want to make sure that people remember, oh yeah, those guys at Steinberg, yeah, they're doing that notation thing. Oh, that'll be cool when it eventually comes out one day. But also that there is actually some value in kind of taking a close look at these things in the broader sense of how, well, I just hadn't thought about it before, and it's really fun to actually, well, fun for me because I am a terrible nerd to really dig into that stuff and to really kind of try and do almost a comparative study of these things and try to understand why something works better and doesn't. And again, the comments on that blog post are very interesting because there's such a divergent range of opinions about, well, I think they shouldn't allow the stems to get that short, and oh, well, this looks clearer here, and that kind of discussion is really interesting. And in one sense, it's even like kind of beta testing for us in a funny kind of a way, because if a sort of a consensus emerges, as it did, I think, when I did the post last year on how the offsets between interlocking voices should work, and I'd came up with something that I thought that looked pretty good to my eye, but then as soon as I put it up on the blog, there was pretty unanimous derision towards my defaults, which is cool. I'm fine with that. I'm not precious about it, and so we were able to make some changes right then and there. Literally within a day or two of that blog post going up, we were able to make some improvements in the program that we would have, if we hadn't had that kind of way to communicate with people who were interested and to really show them the detail, that would have been months and months and months down the line before we perhaps got to beta testing for real, that we had the opportunity to improve it. So we get a lot out of it as well. I'm glad that people, whether they're other software developers or musicians, are finding the blog post useful, but they're actually quite good validation for the work that we're doing in terms of making our product better as well, so that they really hopefully benefit in lots of ways.
Yeah, you mentioned something that I was really glad to hear. So like haven't ever taken the time or haven't been able to afford a book like The Art of Music Engraving and Processing by Ted Ross. You mentioned sources like that and a bunch of other sources, and also that you learned something about beaming and stuff in your research. Have there been any in your time digging deeper into all the facets of notation, have you been surprised or found anything particularly interesting?
Oh golly, that's a big question. I mean, I must say I tend not to veer too far from the standard text. I'm very lucky that I have all of them on my desk. So if I really, I'll suddenly just kind of go and I can then reach for any one of about half a dozen of the standard books about this and that. I mean, I have actually spent quite a lot of time in the British Library looking things up again. Very lucky to be able to just hop on the tube and be at the British Library in about a quarter of an hour, which is great. And that I've been going through a number of, I've looked at a couple of composers' original manuscripts, although that hasn't generally been what I've needed to look at. But there've been a lot of interesting papers written on various aspects of music notation. Some incredibly esoteric things. I can tell you a lot of it to do with SMuFL, where you kind of really got to I just don't know the answer to this. It's not going to be covered by any of the standard texts. I've got to go to the British Library and find the journal where this was talked about 30 years ago, whatever, and look it up. Anything particularly surprising? I can't think off the top of my head, but again, I feel very fortunate that I can actually spend the time to do this. Luckily, because I'm a thicko and I can't program, one of the things that I can do is I can sort of offer context and try to distill requirements down so that the people who are much cleverer than me and can do all the programming can figure out what to do. And certainly sometimes the actual act of figuring out what those requirements are by going and reading a whole load of stuff that I wouldn't otherwise get the opportunity to read is definitely one of the benefits of the job. But I can't think of anything off the top of my head that has particularly surprised me.
You mentioned the multiple voice thing. I was wondering if there were any other things like that. What are some kind of the general sentiments that you're getting in the feedback on the blog or on Twitter or wherever else that you're hearing from normal users about the sorts of things you've been talking about on the blog that have made it back into the development team?
Yeah, well, like I say, I think a decent amount of, I mean, I've been amazed actually at the amount of feedback on the blog post. They each kind of get dozens and dozens of comments, and people do really read them. Which again, when you look at sort of like 5,000 words on beams, who the hell wants to read that? You know,
I read it.
but I mean, it's fantastic. Yes, well, great. I'm glad you guys all did read it, and you know, that's again very gratifying as well, because you sort of sit there and you think, wow, I'm even boring myself on this topic, but. But no, people do really read them and really feedback very strongly how they feel about it. And again, I think that's a good validation for us, that people are interested enough in what we're doing in terms of building this new scoring program, that even though it's, you know, months and months before they have a chance to actually use it, they're interested enough to really read in detail what we're doing and to tell us what they like and what they don't like about it. And on the whole, I would say the comments are very supportive. You know, people are generally saying, this looks very good, you're really sweating the details, this is all, you know, what we want to see. You do, of course, occasionally get people saying, hey, I don't see anything written here about, you know, Thuringian nose flute, or, well, no, that's a bit glib, I'm sorry, I don't mean that. Firstly, I'm sure it's very important that we get our Thuringian nose flute support right, but secondly, I think that, you know, that what I really mean is, you know, people saying, well, hey, are you going to go into the same kind of detail as you are about beaming, about, say, you know, workflow issues or playback or whatever? And a lot of the reason why we haven't been covering that stuff is, well, for playback, it's because we don't have playback yet, as it happens. You know, we're still working with the guys in Hamburg to get the Cubase audio engine kind of integrated with our application. So until we actually can make it even play back, you know, crummy MIDI piano sounds or whatever, you know, there's really nothing to talk about with playback. We have big ideas, but nothing to show for them yet. But it's also partly because those are perhaps some of the areas where we are hopefully doing things that are more interesting and maybe would be less wise to reveal at this early stage, in terms of tipping our hand to the competitions as to what we're actually working on in some of those areas. So I tend to choose the engraving things because, you know, our program has to do beams, it has to do accidentals, it has to do multiple voices. You know, these are things that we just have to do. And as I alluded to earlier on, I kind of talk about this continuum of sort of richness in the rules that you deal with and so on, and we're trying to always go a long way down that road. And so the blog post is a nice way for me to communicate to people about the attention to detail that we're putting into this project. And hopefully, even though people aren't necessarily seeing it written explicitly on the blog, people will see that if we're putting this kind of attention to detail into these very basic things, they will hopefully sort of infer from that, because I'm certainly trying to imply it, that we are also putting the same degree of care and consideration into the other aspects that we're not really able to talk about yet.
We have no doubt.
Yeah, that actually, another thing that you mentioned earlier, you mentioned, you know, having this feedback and sitting down with a test user on some of this stuff. How long have you been, like, actually working with, you know, normal people outside the development team on this project?
I don't think that's
for a while.
Actually, working with normal people on music notation. That's.
I guess that's a little bit of a paradox.
Yeah, well, I mean, we started very, very quickly to kind of gather up people who we thought would have, you know, expert knowledge in particular areas. Obviously, I've been very fortunate over the years. I've been working in this field to kind of meet and get to know people who have tremendous amount of experience, and so we shopped ourselves around to all the publishers, and we had a meeting at the Musicians Union early on with some of the pro arrangers and so on, and songwriters and so on who are using scoring programs there. We try to stay in touch with all of those, and then we've also, you know, more recently, really only in the last sort of few months, as the application starts to look like a real application that you can use, and we can actually start exploring some of the actual workflows. So, you know, just after Christmas, we started showing how some of the note entry stuff works to just a couple of individual people who we trust not to go and spill the beans, and to sort of, and we actually got some incredibly valuable feedback from we sort of showed it to 2 or 3 people in the space of a week, and we realized pretty quickly that we had to do some reasonably major surgery on one aspect of it in order to make it easy to understand. So we found a way of, without sort of removing any functionality, but expressing the functionality that we wanted to be there in a way that made more sense, and it definitely instantly improved what we were doing in that regard. So there is incredible value to be had from it, because when you're looking at it every day, you're just so close to it, and sometimes something that is incredibly obvious to you ends up being decidedly non-obvious to everybody else. And so actually just having a sanity check is really, really valuable. And so we definitely anticipate doing that more and more as we get closer towards the point where we can actually allow outside of our little four walls in London people to be using it more, because we do get a tremendous amount from having that kind of reaction. It's a bit disappointing on one level to have the but on the other hand, you can then dig into it and find out how you go, and then everything's better.
Yeah, on one of your recent posts, there's like a little GIF image of doing articulations on a note, and that little piece of user interface looks wonderful. I can't wait to see the rest of it.
Yes, that's the first actual little bit of real UI that we've shown in there. Yeah, the UI has been very interesting. My colleague Anthony has been working almost exclusively on the visual design and on, again, keeping me honest in terms of the user interaction stuff. And he's a very good sounding board for when I think it should work X and he thinks it should work Y, and then we have a good tete-a-tete about why it should work whichever way, and we normally come up with something good on the other side of it. No, we're very lucky to have Anthony working on it, because we had set out some goals in terms of what we wanted the user interface to achieve, in terms of we want it to be pretty understated, because in a document-centric application like a scoring program, you actually want the music, the main document editing area, to be the main focus, and so you don't want lots of glitzy UI around the outside that kind of detracts from that. We also wanted it, because we were starting in 2012, 2013, we wanted it to be resolution independent. That was very important, and it's still actually quite difficult to do truly resolution independent displays, user interfaces that work consistently across Windows and Mac, because the way that high DPI stuff works on each platform isn't quite right, and you don't want to sort of tie yourself into just Retina, because Windows has a kind of a variable DPI mode and so on. So one of the things that we've done is try to stick to this rule that we have no bitmap graphics in the user interface at all. So everything is done either with kind of CSS style, scalable drawing, or with font characters. So all of the musical symbols that appear in the user interface are all done with fonts, and then there's actually sort of a fair amount of text typography type stuff done in the UI as well. And everything's going to be done using this kind of declarative approach with CSS style drawing and font characters, so that the user interface is very kind of minimal and clean. It has the sort of consequence of being relatively flat in appearance as well, not completely like block colors and so on, but subtle, because again, when you're dealing with a page of music, typically the background of that is going to be light colored, white or cream or buff or whatever, and the front is going to be black, and there's not going to be a huge amount of color contrast in the actual document itself, and you don't want this very blingy user interface around the outside of it kind of overshadowing your music. It's important that the focus of the application is on the music that you're writing, and so we're trying to make sure the user interface is understated, functional, clear, and is put together in such a way that it sort of gives us room to grow and room to adapt to different kinds of displays and so on as the program matures.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to watch the whole project grow, and we're so pleased that you're so open as you are to sharing these development diaries. It's even if I were not interested in the particular application that you were making, which I very much am, but even if I weren't, I would find the things that you were writing about very, very interesting. So thank you very much for doing all that. I'm sure it takes a lot of time to write one of these giant blog posts.
Sure does.
I'm wondering, you said you used the term months in terms of how long people are going to have to wait before they can use this. Is there any kind of an extremely soft release date?
I could have used seconds. There would be even more of them.
Yeah, 180 months.
We'll fix it in post.
It's still a duration of time.
Yeah, no, I mean we are. One of the things that is kind of hardest about the project is that it's kind of hard to predict how long it's going to take, and this is also presumably frustrating to our colleagues in Hamburg too. But we're kind of, because we are doing it properly, and of course we have tremendous support from the company for doing it properly. Steinberg wants to release something that lives up to the standard of all of its other products, which are also of extremely high quality, and we want to make sure that the quality is there. But in addition to having the quality, we also have to actually be able to do all of the basic kinds of notation. And unlike, say, a text editor, where you really only have to worry about 26 lowercase letters, 26 uppercase characters, a few numerics, and some punctuation, the world of music notation is so incredibly complex, and there are so many things in the grammar that you have to kind of be able to handle that at the moment is actually kind of hard for us to predict, even when we're going to have all of the basic notations covered. We have slurs now, we have notes and accidentals and beams and articulations, but for example we don't have hairpins, and we don't have tempo, and we don't have glissandos, and we don't have ornaments, and and the list goes on and on. And so we just have to continue, if you like, building up the alphabet of the building blocks of the things so that we can eventually build the words and then string together the sentences and then the paragraphs, and then we'll be ready. But it's hard to predict.
Certainly.
We're working as hard and as fast as we can. That much I will say.
Well,
to be fair, Sam knew that was the answer, but you feel obligated to at least mention it.
Well, I'm very interested because I am so frustrated. All my students use Sibelius, and I'm a Finale guy, so I now have reasons. There's things I hate about both programs.
And things you like about both programs.
And yes, absolutely.
Balance,
things I like, but not to toot my own horn, but for my position of power, if when it's released, I can suggest I might be able to give you 12 lab installs. That's right, 12 whole lab installs.
Our first 12 sales sounds good to me.
There you go.
If I can get a grant, I might be able to up your 12 and to 24 here.
Yeah.
So.
And I know you won't tell us this information, but I'm wondering if you have a name for it yet.
We definitely do have a name for it, yes, but I will not tell you what it is.
That's one thing that you didn't have last time we spoke, and I was looking at the FAQ on Making Notes today, and you do say that you have one, but it's just not for public consumption.
Yes, I don't know exactly when we will. I think the way that we probably do it is we will reveal the name once we know when we're going to be shipping it, and it'll be part of that kind of, because I hope that although we have been fairly open to this point in terms of what we're working on and what we're trying to do and so on, once we actually get to the point where we can actually really start to imagine the day when this thing reaches the hands of musicians out there in the world, then we'll be able to say much more about some of the workflow things that we haven't spoken about, and some of the other unique features that we've been working on that aren't present in other scoring programs. And then the name will be perhaps the first step towards that actual road towards getting the thing out the door and into everybody's hands. And it will be a fine day when that day comes, I can assure you. We're looking forward to it, probably more even than people outside of Steinberg are looking forward to it, but we do have to wait a little bit longer.
Well, I think I speak for all of us when I say we're looking forward to it a great deal. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning, Daniel.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Before we wrap, I did just want to make one quick plug to anybody that's in Baltimore. Of course, we, like a lot of other people in the U.S., have been following all the wild and less wild events of Baltimore over the last week or two. And this seems to just have been a coincidence, but our friend David Smook, composer and professor at the Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore, is actually going to be hosting or moderating a panel discussion tomorrow night on arts in communities. And we saw a bunch of examples of Peabody students and faculty performing and being involved in a positive way in the Baltimore community this last week, and I just wanted to make a quick plug for this conversation, this public panel that he's moderating. This is tomorrow as I'm recording this, May 4th, Monday evening at 5 p.m. at the George Peabody Library in Baltimore. So I know that Probably not everyone is able to go to Baltimore for this conversation, but if you do happen to be within a reasonable travel distance, we wanted to just bring that to your attention. I think it should be fascinating, and I cannot wait to hear the results of such a conversation. So
it lives on the web as a Facebook invitation thing, and I'll have a link in the show notes.
Correct. We'll have a link to that. We'll have a link to Daniel's Making Notes blog and a bunch of other stuff that we talked about today on our site, soundnotion.tv/SN. You can find links to all the things we talked about this week and all the things we talked about last week and the week before, going back now 204 episodes, including, we should probably link to the episode from 2 years ago with Daniel. That'll be scary. I don't want to see
how many more gray hairs I have.
Yeah, we don't want to see what anybody looked like 2 years ago.
You were beardless back then, in case you didn't remember.
Wow, golly, so it really is a long time ago.
So we will have a link to that for everyone's shame at soundnotion.tv/SN. If you would like to follow us, we're on Twitter at SoundNotion. You can follow Daniel D. Spreadbury. Thank you so much for joining us and listening this week. We'll be back next week.
SMuFL.
Bless you.
Sam.
So,